It begins with a storm, not a soft drizzle or harmless shower, but a furious, howling tempest. One of those wild Yorkshire nights when the wind wails like a wounded beast, the skies tear open with lightning, and the River Nid swells with cold, rushing water. Trees groan, roofs creak, and somewhere, hidden in the cliffs outside the market town of Knaresborough, a baby is born in the dark. The year is 1488. England is still catching its breath after years of civil war. The first Tudor king, Henry VII, sits on a throne he barely holds. Across the land, suspicion runs deep, of foreigners, of women, of magic. And on this night, suspicion has reason to stir. The mother is a young woman named Ursula Southeil, unmarried, impoverished, and outcast from the community, just a teenager, and said by many to be touched by madness. Some claim she had no kin, others whisper she had no soul, but all agree that she was found heavy with child and banished from the town. No bed was offered, no midwife sent, so she turned to the forest and then to the caves in the limestone cliffs near the river. There, in the flickering dark beneath a sky slashed with thunderbolts, she gave birth. And from that cave, something entered the world that would never quite belong in it. The child, Ursula, was strange from the start. Her cries were sharp, high, unnatural. Some who claimed to have seen her later in infancy swore her body was misshapen. Twisted spine, long hooked nose, eyes too bright, too aware. Within hours the rumours had taken root. They called her a devil's child, a warning, a punishment. And as the wind howled through the trees that night, more than one candle was lit in prayer. The authorities took Agatha away, locked her in a poorhouse far from Knaresborough, where she would spend the rest of her life in silence. She was never allowed to see her child again. But Ursula remained. Whatever the case, the child grew up just outside the boundaries of town, close to nature, but never truly part of the world that surrounded her. Even as a toddler, villagers claimed she would sit for hours staring at the trees as if they whispered to her. Animals followed her but kept their distance. Her laughter was rare, her silence frequent. By the time she could speak, she was asking questions no one could answer, and offering answers to things no one had yet asked. For now, she was a child raised in the margins, in a world where people looked over their shoulders and crossed themselves when they passed the spot where she was born. And still, the stories grew. By the age of 6, Ursula was already the stuff of legend. She knew when cows would calve, when storms would strike, when roofs would fall. The town didn't want her, but they feared her more than they hated her, which in those days was almost a kind of power. She lived on the edge of town, of society, of everything, a child both present and apart. While other children played in the dusty lanes of Knaresborough, Ursula wandered alone through the woods and meadows that bordered the River Nid. These were her places, quiet, green, and indifferent to human fear. The trees did not judge her, the wind did not whisper behind her back. The crows, at least, never lied. Those who took her in gave her shelter and basic care. But there was never any sense of family. Ursula was tolerated, not loved. Watched closely but never embraced. She grew like wild thyme through the stone, hardy, crooked, and out of place. Even from an early age there was something about her that unnerved people. She rarely cried. She rarely laughed. Her speech came late, but when it did, it arrived in full sentences, often laced with strange old words no one remembered teaching her. She would say things that made the hair rise on the back of your neck, about death, illness, storms, or distant events she had no way of knowing. Once, when she was still only a child, she told a baker his chimney would fall before nightfall. He laughed, but by sunset his roof lay in splinters, and half the village had gathered to stare, not at the chimney, but at the girl who'd said it would happen. It was the same story again and again, a misplaced tool, a missing sheep, a child about to take sick. Ursula knew before anyone else. They began calling her things, some in jest, some in fear, witch's whelp, devil's daughter, cunning lass, demon brat. But underneath the names was a growing unease. People began to avoid her. Mothers clutched their children tighter when she walked past. Market stalls fell quiet when she approached, yet still they came to her when they were desperate. If a child had fever, they came, or cows gave no milk, they came. They came with bribes of eggs, bread, and herbs. And she, odd, unsmiling, unnerving, would often give them answers they didn't want to hear, but would later swear had come true. She was uneducated in the traditional sense. No school would take her, but nature was her tutor. She read the land like a book, watched how clouds formed, how animals shifted before storms, how moss grew only on the shaded side of stone. She collected roots, bark, and lichen, knew which plants healed and which ones harmed. It was said she could charm a waterway or cure a bleeding wound with nothing but ash and whispering. It was also said she spoke to things no one else could see. One tale tells of Ursula, aged no more than 8, standing in the woods beneath a pale full moon, speaking softly to a blackbird that didn't fly away. Another swears she could call foxes to her with just a look. A farmer once followed her, out of suspicion or curiosity, no one's quite sure, and claimed to see her standing in the river, barefoot in winter, water up to her knees, eyes closed, murmuring words in a language he didn't recognize. When she turned and looked at him, he ran, not out of fear of her, but out of something deeper, a feeling that he had glimpsed a world that wasn't meant to be seen. Ursula Southeil was never truly part of the town that raised her, but she was never entirely separate from it either. She existed in that uncomfortable middle ground, part cautionary tale, part whispered miracle. As she entered her teenage years, her features sharpened. Her crooked spine became more visible, her nose more prominent. She looked nothing like the fair maiden sung of in ballads, and yet there was something arresting about her presence. Her gaze was heavy, her voice low and deliberate. People listened when she spoke, even when they didn't want to, and she always knew more than she should. She knew when the butcher's wife was hiding bruises. She knew which men were stealing wood from the forest. She could tell from the smell of the river when it would flood. She saw signs in candle wax, in smoke, in the flight of birds. It was around this time that she began to earn another name, Wise Woman, a double-edged title. For some, it meant healer, seer, a last hope when nothing else worked. For others, it meant witch. And in 15th century England, the line between the two was dangerously thin. Church officials were uneasy. Local priests urged her to keep silent. She did not. If she had visions, she shared them. If she saw danger, she warned of it. And slowly, what had begun as local folklore began to grow into legend. By the time Ursula was 16, people came from beyond Knaresborough to find her. Farmers, merchants, sometimes noblemen in cloaks with questions they never dared ask in daylight. And Ursula, with her bent back, her dark eyes, her strange, halting speech, she answered them, not always kindly, but always truthfully. She was still years away from the great prophecies she would one day be known for. The visions of burning cities, iron beasts, and flying ships. But the roots of that power were already firmly in the ground. She was not a child any more, not a curiosity, not a misfit. She was something else, something the world did not yet know how to name. By the time Ursula Southeil was 20, there was no longer any debate. She was different, not just odd, not just clever, different. People had stopped arguing about whether she had a gift. The arguments now were about where it came from. Was it a blessing or something far more dangerous? The market towns of Yorkshire were full of superstition. Every village had its tales of witches, cunning folk, and second sight. Most of these were just that, stories. But Ursula was not a tale passed between drinks in a tavern. She was real, living, walking through the lanes with her bent back, her wild hair, and her gaze that made grown men falter. Her childhood visions had grown bolder. She began to speak of things that hadn't yet happened, but would. A fire in the baker's roof, a priest who would fall ill after Christmas, a merchant's son who would drown before the harvest. Each time, people tried to ignore her. Each time, they couldn't. When these predictions came to pass, and they always did, she earned a kind of reverence, uncomfortable, quiet, and laced with fear. By now, people came to her door with offerings, coins, bread, a length of ribbon, a ring that had belonged to a dead aunt, and always a question: will my wife live through childbirth? Should I plant barley this spring? Will my brother return from war? Is she faithful to me? And sometimes Ursula answered them. Other times she only looked at them, long, hard, and silent, and that silence said more than words ever could. Not all her visions were grim. There were stories of her saving sick children with a poultice of herbs and boiled moss, of her guiding lost travellers by describing landmarks they hadn't yet seen, of her warning a shepherd that his sheepdog would be bitten by an adder, then handing him a remedy hours before it happened. But for every tale of healing, there were two of dread. She once told a stonemason to cancel a journey south. He didn't listen. His cart flipped crossing the ooze, drowned. She warned a local lord that his mistress would betray him. He laughed in her face. 2 weeks later, she vanished, along with a sack of silver and 3 of his best horses. It wasn't just what Ursula said. It was how she said it. Never boastfully, never loudly. Her voice was calm, almost distant, like she was watching something no one else could see. A thread unravelling from the future into the present. There were moments, quiet, almost secret, where the legends claim she would slip away for days at a time, returning only when the moon was full. But whatever she did in those woods, she always came back sharper, stronger, with a new edge to her words. It was around this time, mid to late 20s, that Tobias Shipton entered her story. A carpenter from York, hard-working, ordinary, a man who, by every account, had no interest in mystics, witches, or prophecy. And yet, for reasons no one ever fully understood, he fell for Ursula. And she, strangely unexpectedly, married him. The townsfolk were stunned. They whispered that she'd bewitched him, that she'd bound him with spells or charmed his sleep. But those who knew Tobias said otherwise. He simply saw something others didn't. Perhaps he saw the loneliness beneath her power, or maybe he just didn't care what her nose looked like, or that people crossed the street to avoid her. For a brief time, she lived not as a seer or outcast, but as a wife. There's little said about their marriage, except that it was quiet and that they seemed content. There were no children, and within a few years Tobias died, peacefully, they say, leaving Ursula alone once more. But she kept his name, Ursula Shipton, and in time the people would give her another, mother. It was after Tobias's death that Ursula's prophecies began to grow in scale. She began speaking not just of local things, births, deaths, storms, but of cities burning, kings falling, great wars yet to come. She spoke of metal monsters crawling across the land, of ships sailing without sails, of men flying like birds. People laughed at first, but those who had lived in Knaresborough all their lives, who had seen her predictions unfold too often to doubt, grew quiet. They began to write her words down, to keep them, to pass them on. She didn't charge for her visions, she didn't seek power or titles, she simply spoke. And the more she spoke, the further her name spread. Ursula Shipton, Mother Shipton, was now a name known across the north of England, not by noblemen, not by scholars, but by farmers, fishwives, woodsmen and smiths, ordinary people, people who trusted instinct more than doctrine, people who felt the shape of things long before they were written in books. And so, a legend was born, not in courts or cathedrals, but in firelit kitchens, in the hush of midnight roads, in the breathless moment just after something terrible or miraculous came true. By now the woman once known as Ursula Southeil had fully become Mother Shipton, a name wrapped in awe, in rumour, in quiet fear. She was no longer just the strange girl of Knaresborough with crooked bones and an unnatural gaze. She had become something else, a mouthpiece for a force that no one could quite name. By the mid-1500s, people weren't just listening to her, they were writing her down. Her words, strange and twisted with old dialect and layered metaphor, began to travel farther than her feet ever did. They were copied and shared, first by hand, then in crude pamphlets passed between traders and pilgrims, wrapped in leather and worry. But what made those words so haunting, so enduring, wasn't just how strange they were. It was how many of them seemed to come true. One of her earliest, widely remembered predictions was simple, almost too simple. Water shall come over Ouse Bridge, and a windmill shall be set upon a tower, and an elm tree shall lie at every man's door. To a 16th century ear it made little sense. The River Ouse, flooded before. Nothing new. A windmill on a tower? Absurd. Elm trees? Perhaps poetic, perhaps nonsense. But decades later, as rivers swelled and cities grew, a windmill was placed atop a tower in York. Elm planks became the common wood for doors across the region, and the river, year after year, rose higher. Coincidence, perhaps, but then came others. She described carriages without horses, boats made of iron, and men who flew like birds. She spoke of a great fire that shall devour London, and war that shall stretch across the world like a spider's web. She even said, around the world men's thoughts shall fly, quick as the twinkling of an eye. To a Tudor mind, this was fantasy, madness, the ramblings of a woman too long in shadow. But read centuries later, these words would chill the spine. Some believe she had foreseen the Great Fire of London in 1666. Others claimed she predicted the First World War, the rise of industrial cities, even the invention of the internet, though she wouldn't have known the word. Her language was tangled, poetic, rough, but if you listen carefully, through the layers of old Yorkshire dialect, the shape of the future could be heard breathing beneath her voice. As industry rose across England and coal turned the green fields black, her writings found new life. Victorians, obsessed with invention and the occult in equal measure, seized on her prophecies. They printed books, they forged a statue, they turned her cave, deep in the cliffs by the River Nid, into a place of pilgrimage. Even Queen Victoria is said to have inquired about her. She became more than a seer. She became an oracle of modernity, a strange bridge between a forgotten magical past and a roaring, soot-stained future. But here's the strange part. None of her writings survive in her own hand. Not a single letter, no diary, no known correspondence. Everything we have comes from others, decades, sometimes centuries later. Recorded from memory, reprinted with additions, twisted by agenda or misunderstanding. So how much of what we now call her prophecies are truly hers? We can't say. And maybe that's the point. Because Mother Shipton wasn't just a woman. She had become a mirror, a figure people could project their hopes and fears onto. When times were dark, when cities burned or war came or plagues returned, people turned to her old words and found meaning. And when the world changed again, steam, flight, bombs, wires, her name was there again, lurking between the lines. Of course, there were doubters, scholars, historians, priests. They dismissed her, said her prophecies were added after the events, called them hoaxes, forgeries, said no peasant woman in the 1500s could have foreseen the age of machines or the fall of empires. And they may be right. But here's the thing. People still believed her. They carried her words like charms, whispered them during storms, quoted her during times of war. In the darkest hours, Mother Shipton's voice, real or imagined, still echoed. Because it wasn't just what she said, it was how people needed to believe that someone, somewhere, might have seen all this coming. That the chaos of history might have some shape, some rhythm, some warning. The world to an end shall come in 1881. That particular line became infamous. It spread panic as the year 1881 approached. Preachers shouted it from pulpits. Children asked their mothers if the world would end tomorrow. Some say people refused to plant crops that spring. And then it didn't happen. The world, of course, carried on. And yet somehow her power didn't fade. Because Mother Shipton had never really belonged to a single year or even a single story. She was folklore, warning, mystery. She wasn't about dates or facts. She was about possibility. The unsettling idea that someone could look at a quiet river and see fire, machines and bombs waiting in its reflection. Mother Shipton died in the year 1561, or so the old records say. She was likely in her early 70s, no small feat in an age where most didn't see 50, no dramatic end, no bolt of lightning, no vanishing into smoke, just a quiet death in Knaresborough, the town where she had been born, feared, mocked, and, eventually, revered. But if death came quietly, the legend did not rest. In fact, it was only just beginning. For 200 years after her death, Ursula Shipton remained a local tale, something whispered in the north of England, carried from grandmother to grandchild, from hunter to farmer. Her cave by the River Nid, where she was said to have spent her later years, became a place of pilgrimage, though humble, a curiosity, a place where water turned objects to stone. But in 1641, something changed. A London bookseller named Richard Head published a pamphlet titled The Strange and Wonderful History of Mother Shipton. It was written in the voice of Ursula herself, or at least what Head imagined her voice to be. It included dozens of rhyming prophecies, visions and riddles. Was it accurate? Almost certainly not. Did it matter? Not at all. The pamphlet sold by the thousands, reprinted, expanded, passed between merchants and sailors, its language updated and reshaped over and over. By the 1700s there were multiple versions, each adding more prophecies, some vague, others disturbingly precise. One warned of Napoleon. Another seemed to describe Queen Victoria's reign. Some even hinted at global wars and the rise of America as a world power. Tourists came to Knaresborough to see the cave, to stand in the place where she was said to have been born, to touch the petrifying well that turned trinkets to stone. They bought pamphlets, souvenirs, even talismans. They spoke her name like a spell. The Victorians, with their appetite for ghosts, mystics, and the mysteries of time, adopted her fully. A statue was raised near her cave. Her prophecies were carved into plaques. Children were taught her verses in school. But somewhere in all this celebration, the truth of Ursula's life slipped further into shadow. How much of what we now call Mother Shipton was ever really her? The truth is, we don't know. The only contemporary account of her life comes from a man named Samuel Pepys, who mentioned her in his famous diary in 1667, over a century after her death. Everything else? Stories, guesses, additions, and yet her voice feels real. Not because it was recorded, but because people have carried it forward for 500 years, through wars, through revolutions, through every great moment that she seemed to predict, or at least that people wanted her to.